The Chande went first. He crouched down immediately and searched for life, sweeping back and forth with his burner. Nothing moved. The 2D slipped in after him. He ignored her for the moment. She could take care of herself. What she lacked in skill, she made up for with intelligence. It would have to be enough. He scanned the long dark corridor through the eyes of the mask. More of the alien's spittle secretion, tadiki, lined the steep walls. It was a brittle substance, but could provide camouflage for hiding drones. The lenses showed nothing. He glanced at the 2D. Her sickly pale skin seemed whiter than before. Nothing, he said. She babbled a short reply. The words were nonsense, but the tone was watchful and ready. They crept forward. The 2D stumbled behind him. Apparently humans didn't see well in the dark. She followed closer. At the end of the corridor, another door, open. The Chande heard the Kaimda Amada as they skittered somewhere beyond. He ducked his head to get through the portal and discovered that he would have to move in a crouch through the next hall. The Uman ceiling was lower here. The Chande had gone into 3 nests before this one, but always with fully stocked burners and at least a handful of armed Yautja with him. Not to mention that he felt like a month-old Rejet turd. His side ached from the drone attack, and each steep breath burned somewhere inside. From his experience and the way he felt, the wounds were fairly serious. Well, nothing to be done about it. He wasn't afraid. Blooded warriors seldom were in battle, but he accepted that dying could come easily here. He hoped it would come with honour. The real pity would be that there was no one to tell the tale. No one except the small Uman, assuming she survived as well. They moved forward in the thick dark. Noguchi tripped on something and caught herself before she fell. There was virtually no light. Every dozen paces or so, a small dim emergency torch set high into the wall illuminated just enough to make it seem darker. She could make out her own weapon and Broken Tusk's back. Beyond that, nothing. The warrior seemed to be able to see better. He must have done this a dozen times, and he obviously knew something about the alien's behaviour. Noguchi felt her gut clench at the sound of movement ahead somewhere. She gripped her weapon tighter, her eyes wide and semi-blind. They stepped into a second corridor. The air grew muggier as they progressed. Their footsteps were oddly muffled by the strange alien material that lay thick on the floor. She should be in front, she knew that. The Chande had looked at the map Conover had given her, but his understanding of it couldn't be clear. Then again, he could see better and was stronger. As they neared the end of the second hallway, Noguchi heard another alien chitter, close, from behind them. The Chande whipped around at the drone's cry and pointed his burner. The 2D had also heard it. She fired at the bug as it ran for them. The shot from her burner hit the drone in the shoulder and spun it around. It didn't fall. The Chande aimed his burner at the screaming creature. Light and heat spewed in a tight beam. The drone's back exploded outward in a spray of corrosive blood and cooked entrails. Footfalls. He spun. 2 drones attacked from the front. The Chande turned, got the first with his bladed wrist, a sharp slashing jab to the bug's throat. The second clambered over its falling brother and reached for him. The Chande knocked it down, used the burner as a club to crush its jaws. Blood hissed over the durable metal and dripped to the floor, 8 holes in the hard material. The 2D inhaled sharply and fired past him at a third drone, and missed. The hard meat turned and sprinted away from them, down the third winding corridor, shrieking an alarm to the others. It was too stupid to be afraid, so it must be a sentry. The Chande cursed. Behind him, he was pretty certain the 2D did the same in her own language. He didn't need a translator to understand that. Well, it just meant they'd have to hurry. He had hoped to make it farther. The leader picked up his pace and hit the hallway at a jog, the 2D right behind. Ahead, the hard meat waited. She was terrified, but ready. This had to be done, or else the colonists would die. And you too, Machiko. No shit. At the end of the third hall, the corridor came to a T-junction. Noguchi pointed for Broken Tusk to turn left. She hoped she'd remember the rest as they came to it. She moved blindly behind Broken Tusk. There would be a rung ladder on the right pretty soon. A bug hissed behind her. Noguchi turned and fired. The shots were deafening in the closed area. The aliens' dying screams were quieter. This was getting old real goddamn fast. She turned again, just in time to see a bolt of hard light come from the warrior's weapon, accompanied by an echoey thud. It acted as a strobe, showed them a nightmare of dark limbs and shiny teeth. More screaming. Noguchi breathed the stifling air shallowly. Her body twitched and jumped as she searched the darkness for the ladder. Her chest had started to bleed again. Maybe she was already dead and didn't realize it. Maybe they were in hell. The Chande felt the human slap him on the back and turned. The Tudi pointed up, her face distorted. She seemed disturbed, as far as he was able to read her expression. He eyed the flimsy ladder and then started to climb. The narrow rungs allowed him to take 3 at a time. The Chande reached the top and looked down at the small warrior. She swung her weapon in an arc. Dull light glinted off the small metallic burner. He looked up again, reached for the floor of the next level. A clawed hand dropped down to cover his own, the black talons etched into his wrist, raising small fountains of blood. The drone bent down and hissed into his face. Noguchi looked up just in time. The bug leaned towards Broken Tusk and opened its jaws. She aimed and squeezed. The AP bullet went into the alien's mouth and out of the back of its head. It fell forward, almost toppled Broken Tusk from the ladder, and then clattered to the floor. If the maker of this ammunition ever asked, she would give them a testimonial they wouldn't believe. This here stuff is a monster killer. Never leave your cube without a few dozen rounds. A shriek from her left. She fired, and fired again as they seemed to come at her from all sides. The noise was incredible. Click. That was louder. The Chande stood up and hit the first drone to come at him with a weighted staff. It dropped, still alive but out of the fight. There was nothing behind it, at least for a few seconds. He turned to cover the 2D on her climb. At the same time, her weapon fire stopped. A drone leapt at her, knocked her back against the ladder. The Chande felt pure rage. He jumped from the second level, staff in front of him, and landed on the drone. Like that, Tarai-san? The drone did not, so he killed it. Noguchi was dizzy. Broken Tusk stamped the life out of the bug that had grabbed her. He tucked her under his arm and ascended the rung ladder easily. He set her down first, and then pulled himself up after her. Noguchi reloaded her gun and then covered him, but the last few hissing shapes that were below backed away, and then turned and scampered off. That didn't really seem like a victory, somehow. She looked down the second level corridor. The next ladder would be at the end, but their escape was only a few meters away. Much as she wanted Broken Tusk to come with her, someone needed to guard the escape pod, and Broken Tusk probably couldn't run a human computer. At least the passage was clear for the moment. They started down the second level. The human paused midway down the hallway, and then pointed at a doorway with odd figures scrawled on it. Human language. She spoke something. The Chande hit the animal loop on his suit to record, in case later it might be helpful. The 2D motioned at him, and then again at the door. She wanted him to stay here? The Chande growled, but the 2D was adamant. It was important to her. It had been a long time since he had trusted another in battle, and now he was being asked to trust an Ooman, and not even an unblooded Liaocha. She held up her clawless hand again, and then backed away a few steps. The Chande tilted his head at her. The 2D spoke again and bared her teeth at him, and then she turned and ran ahead. He could take her head off with a swipe of his wrist blade, and yet she showed him her teeth. Brave little knife. If she risked his wrath, it must be important to her indeed. Well. This was her kind's ship. She surely knew things about it that he did not. She must have a plan. The Chande stayed. He tilted his head, which she thought meant affirmative. Noguchi felt a rush of relief. She didn't want to part with him in this hot, deadly maze, but she'd need a clear path to get back. She only had maybe a few dozen rounds left. It did not matter how good the ammo was if you were out of it. She hoped Broken Tusk had more for his weapon. "Hold the fort," she said, and grinned tightly. She was scared and she was hurt, but it felt powerful to be doing something that might kill the infestation in her town. You hope. "I'll be back when I'm done." With that, she turned and ran, and prayed that he would be there when she got back. If she got back. The second ladder looked empty, but she couldn't see the top. The strange alien formations were thicker here, looped around the rungs and covered the wall. She checked behind her again and started to climb, revolver in hand. A drop of odd, warm goo smacked onto her arm, then another. She looked up. The Tudi hadn't indicated if she wanted the door he guarded open, but Deshande opened it anyway. The human wanted him to watch it for some reason. It was locked, so he pounded at the frame with the end of his staff until it cracked. It was Tioti, an escape pod, small but large enough for the two of them. He stepped in and surveyed it quickly. Not a nesting area. 3 human-sized chairs and a panel of controls. He'd never be able to squeeze into one of those tiny seats to fly this craft. He turned and stood at the entry to wait for Datudi, and he heard a resounding crash from the direction they'd come from, followed by a low, scratchy hiss. Deshande tensed. It was a sound he had heard before. A queen, heading in this direction. Was it the one they had brought on their ship, egg layer of their prey? Or had one of the drones shifted hormones and metamorphosed into a female? Not that it really mattered, just at the moment. He waited. Noguchi looked up and stopped breathing. One of the bugs had leaned down from the 3rd level, its long, misshapen skull right above her. Another drop of slime fell from its jaws. She brought her pistol up and rammed the barrel into its mouth. She jerked the trigger again and again. The creature didn't even cry out. It fell past her with a clattering thud. It was a small miracle that none of its acidic blood splashed onto her. Her hands shook as she topped the ladder. Surely there would be another at the top, waiting to tear at her, to rip out her throat. Noguchi pulled herself up and onto her knees. The platform was coated heavily with the dark alien material, but otherwise empty. She jumped to her feet and ran down the hall. At the end was another T. Without hesitation, she took a right and continued on. The hot, sticky air made it a struggle to breathe. It smelled like rotten mushrooms in here. It wasn't until 2 more turns in the twisted corridor that she realized she'd gone the wrong way. Deshande took a deep breath and waited. There was no doubt that it was the Queen, or that she was headed toward him. Drones were target practice, but a Queen egg layer? No lone Yautja had ever survived combat with one, unless he had a burner. Once, a dozen blooded warriors had taken one down with only blades and spears, but the Queen had killed 9 of them before she died. Metal creaked and groaned from below. At least he still had a fire in his burner. 2 of them. A crest of shiny black appeared at the top of the ladder. Deshande pointed and fired. Missed. The hard meat ducked and screamed, but was uninjured. He took aim and waited for her to come up. Nothing happened for several beats. Deshande remained ready. Suddenly she howled, and a dark shape sprang into view at the top of the ladder. Deshande fired, his last shot. The head of the creature exploded. He roared in triumph and threw the empty burner at the bubbling mess. The useless weapon skipped over the platform and disappeared. He had killed her, had hunted a queen and killed her. The stories of their intelligence and skill had been wrong. She had been an easy target. The queen hissed again, and the crest of her unmissable skull rose into view. Deshande's eyes widened, but he had blown her to pieces. Decoy. She had sent a drone to take the shots. He had been tricked. But how could she know that? It didn't matter. The deadly queen was alive and she was coming. Siute! He watched as the 2 huge talons screeched across the metal platform and pulled the grinning monster into view. Noguchi didn't bother with the map. She knew where she'd fucked up. There was a second of initial panic. She'd actually left him there to wait for her. Stupid. Noguchi brought it under control and turned back. She was almost back to where she had taken the wrong turn when one of the nightmare creatures leapt out of nowhere to land in front of her. She pointed and fired several times. The snarling animal shrieked and fell. Behind it was another. She pulled the trigger again, and it toppled on top of the other. There were no others. Idiot, your ammo! A cold hand clutched at her heart. The gun was empty. She ejected the spent shells and loaded the final rounds, hands shaking harder now. 6 rounds. Noguchi came to the T and ran straight. For one terrifying moment she felt totally lost, but then she saw the door, yellow and black lines, just as Conover had said. She aimed as carefully as she could and blew the lock off the door. Bits of plastic and metal spewed and stung her face and hands. The door opened to reveal a room full of panels and screens. This was the central computer room, according to what Conver had told her. The ship's brains. Noguchi slammed the door behind her and ran to the second chair. Second chair, straight on, disk slot next to red and black strip. She hit the transmitter's power switch and waited for the panel to light up. She took Scott's disc from her pocket and held it tightly. The seconds stretched like minutes, hours, eons. There was an empty coffee cup on the console in front of her, with Conover stenciled on the side. She felt a stab of pity for the pilot. He had died bravely. The screen glowed to life, with a stream of numbers and letters at the top. She carefully inserted the disc into the slot and pushed the lock button. The computer hummed and blinked. Noguchi felt her breath catch. If this doesn't work, you're dead. A light flashed. Directive received. S. Conover, 93630. Navigational complete. She slapped the board. Yes, yes, yes. It had worked. She turned, just as the door burst inward. The Shande straightened his back and took a deep breath. If this was to be his final hunt, he would die fighting. Combat against the Queen with only a staff. It was an honor. He would fight and he would lose, but that was the only choice. From the way the 2D had gone, he had heard her weapon crash several times. He tuned it out. She would have to complete her mission alone. The Queen was huge, twice as large as a drone. Her arms were longer. She had a second, smaller set protruding from her chest. Her crown sleek and branched, almost like antlers. Her double jaws held more than 2 rows of shiny teeth, and being female, she would know how to fight. She moved toward him slowly. Her long, pointed tail dragged across the metal floor. The Shande raised his staff and held it out slightly, legs spread wide. If she came at him like he thought she would, he would get in at least one clean cut. The Queen towered in the corridor, bent almost in half to move. The Shande held steady. He said, "Come, hard meat. I killed your children. Come and join them." An unlikely boast, and neither she could understand, but smiling into the face of death was said to sometimes unnerve the Black Warrior. A sudden noise behind him called for his attention, but he didn't take his eyes from her. She swung her head to look past him and hissed. The Shande's eyes flickered. Was there someone? The Queen leapt. Noguchi blew the glug's brains across the hall with 2 shots. The dark, jellied mass splattered against the corridor wall and ran down in clumps. She jumped over the corpse and into the passageway. She sprinted for the T. It was over, or it would be soon. The barge was going to fall like a meteor, like an atomic-powered meteor, and when it hit, it would take out what was left of Prosperity Wells. And the rest of the alien brood. There wouldn't be anything remaining here but a smouldering crater. The escape pod should get them far enough out of town. At the turn to get back to the ladder, the corridor beyond exploded into motion. Noguchi let out a cry and then aimed at one of the bugs that sprang for her. The bullet knocked it down, still shrieking. 2 shots now. Only 2 left. Noguchi reached the top of the rung ladder down to the second level. The ladder was twisted, torn loose from the wall. Shit. Broken T. She stopped. Below her, the warrior stood and faced one of the nightmare creatures. A giant, huge, it filled the entire corridor. At the sound of her voice, the monster looked up and hissed. A horrible, raspy sound that chilled her to the pit of her soul. Queen. It spun and lashed out a broken tusk as Noguchi aimed her handgun at it. The impossibly long and heavy tail crashed against the warrior's chest. His spear flew, and he was knocked flying. She heard the sound of the impact from where she was. Broken tusk smacked against the door he guarded and bounced off. His blood seemed to glow dark against the dark armor. He didn't move. Noguchi fired, her chest tight. The queen screamed and turned toward her. The bullet missed. Without thinking, Noguchi jumped to the second level, revolver in front of her. 1 shot left. 1 chance. Her knees buckled as she hit the platform, but she didn't fall. The Queen shrieked and started for her. Noguchi prayed that 1 bullet would stop her. Fired, and the monster fell backward, screamed and thrashed on the floor. Chest shot. Not dead, but down. Noguchi ran to Broken Tusk. She dropped the empty weapon. The Nightmare Queen's tail lashed out and would have knocked her down if she hadn't jumped. Broken Tusk took the lash again in his chest. Blood spattered. Noguchi kicked at the door to the escape pod and stumbled. The inner hatch was open. The Queen screamed, a piercing howl, her death chant. Noguchi hoped. She bent over the injured warrior and got one arm under him. With strength she didn't know she had, she lifted him with a grunt, and he slid with her into the pod. Sweat ran down her face. She pulled again, and his feet cleared the door. No time, no time! She half fell into a chair in front of the panel and searched frantically for the control. Behind her, the alien screamed again in pain and fury. Broken Tusk groaned and rolled towards Noguchi. Noguchi found the button right in front of her. In her panic, she had missed it. Movement behind her. A scream that sent hot, charnel, rotting air across her back. She half turned, hand on the button, and the Queen was there, her head in the pod. Her huge claw came down and embedded in the warrior's shoulder. Broken Tusk screamed. Noguchi slammed the door's override button. The thick metal door closed. The grinning head seemed to rush at her, and then topple to the floor as the pressure door, designed to seal the ship against hard vacuum, crushed the exoskeleton of the monster's relatively thin neck and beheaded the Queen. Her disembodied hand was still buried in the monster's warrior's back. Noguchi hit the next button, and they were free of the larger ship, flying. The pain was bad, but the Shande let it happen. He didn't understand it for a moment. Something. Datudi? Was she here? Had they killed her? He felt oddly weightless for a short time. Flying. And then the floor rose up and slammed against him. There was a burst of new pain. Gravity returned, with more aches than he'd ever had. He was hurt. Badly hurt. Then a rush of hot, clean air. Light assaulted his eyes. His breathing mask was gone. Too much of the planet's combustive oxygen flooded into his lungs. He couldn't last more than a few hours breathing such potent air. He coughed. Warm liquid ran down his throat, but it still felt raw, wounded. A shadow moved over him. He was lifted slightly and pulled. He growled in pain, but couldn't seem to form a protest. The air blinded him. He was outside. He opened his eyes slowly and focused on the face that hovered over his. Datudi. He felt a burst of pride. She had survived, had helped him. Deshande started to speak and coughed again. More pain. He reached for the loop on the arm of his suit, but his fingers had grown clumsy. Datudi placed her fragile hand under his and moved it for him. Noguchi's throat felt tight. There was a stone in her chest, heavy and painful. Pale blood covered the warrior, his breathing slow and laboured. He was dying. They had made it. The pod had landed with a jarring impact somewhere in the East Desert, far from Prosperity Wells. The chute had opened at least, but... Broken Tusk raised a shaky hand towards his other wrist, but couldn't seem to manoeuvre it well. Noguchi guided it for him. It was the recording device. She felt her eyes brim as her own voice spilled out. Hold the fort. I'll be back when I'm done. Broken Tusk grabbed at the alien claw, still embedded in his shoulder. Hang on, she said. Help will be here soon. The colonists will come. She faltered and choked, then gave him what she felt he needed. We did it. We killed the bugs. The Queen. You and I. She waved her hand, feeling helpless. He pulled the Queen's claw loose and looked at it. She pointed at it, nodded, made a throat-cutting gesture. He understood. She was sure of it, because he nodded in return. Then he grasped one of the long, spidery digits and snapped it off, groaned with the exertion. Hissing blood dripped from the finger. Broken Tusk then motioned at the mark on his face, a jagged bolt between his eyes. He motioned at her, and then at the scar again. Noguchi nodded and leaned closer. The Tudi had to be blooded. It was his responsibility, as leader. The Shande tore off one of the Queen's fingers. It hurt to move, to breathe, to live, but this was important. It was all he had left. The Tudi came closer, closed her eyes. Something wet splashed into Shande's face. He ignored it. It was time. The warrior dipped one claw into the alien blood and then spat on the claw. His own blood mixed with the alien's acidic ichor. That was part of it. His blood would partially neutralize the potent chemicals from the hard meat. Moving with great care, he reached out and etched his mark into her pale skin, on the forehead, between her eyes. He managed to keep his hand from shaking long enough to draw his symbol. She hissed in pain, but didn't move. She was brave, little knife. She had helped him, and they'd killed the queen. That was something to take and lay at the feet of the black warrior. Deshande dropped his hand, exhausted. The animal lute played again. Some Ooman speak from long before. It didn't matter. He'd been ready for a long time now, and this was the moment. He had no complaints. He wished he could talk in her language, teach her what he could. Be brave, hunt well, respect your leader. But she already knew most of that. The rest she would surely learn. She was blooded now, and somehow she would learn. Even though they'd only been together for a short time, he knew all about her. The best student he had ever had. Tears fell before Broken Tusk even touched her. She started to wipe at her eyes, but then closed them instead. The dying warrior was going to give her his mark. She understood what he wished. She leaned down. The pain was short and burning. A trickle of green blood ran down her nose. Broken Tusk dropped his hand, and her voice spoke again from the loop, softly this time. I'll remember you. Noguchi lowered her head and started to sob, the first real tears she had cried in a long time. Behind them, a light appeared in the sky. A ball of flame plummeted through the Ryushi sunlight, headed for Prosperity Wells. Noguchi glanced behind her as the explosion thundered through the desert. The air around her compressed suddenly. Fiery air washed over them with the sound, the roar and rumble of it. When the sound died, the town was gone, as quickly as that. She turned back to the warrior, buried her face in her hands, and rocked slowly back and forth. Deshande had stopped breathing. Like the town, he was gone.